Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining. We see there are a few more people joining in, so we'll be just giving it another 30 seconds before starting. Great, let's start. So thank you very much for joining us today. This IRMA Standard Revision live consultation webinar. This is part of a series of live consultations that we have been hosting since the beginning of December last year. And today's session will be focusing on the draft chain of custody standard and its new version for responsibly mined materials. We can go to the next slide. So the program for today's session will be just sharing some general house rules. We'll explain how you can today contribute to the revision process and participate in the revision of these standards. We'll have a brief overview of the IRMA revision process itself, and then my colleagues Jim Kuipers and Christy Disney-Bruckner will take you through the proposed changes from the first version of the draft chain of custody standard to this new draft. We'll have a word about the chain of custody verification process, and we'll make sure we have time to address questions, comments, recommendations at the end. So this event is hosted by IRMA, the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance. This is being recorded, as you may have heard, and the recording will be publicly available on our website and YouTube channel afterwards. I need to remind you that you may not post or send any unlawful, offensive, threatening, defamatory, obscene, or objectionable content. You may not post or send or link to hateful, degrading, criminal, or sensitive imagery or content, nor advocate or promote intolerance or hate against other people. And you may also not post or send any spam content or attempt to drive attention to unrelated products or services. And if you go to the next slide, I'll tell you why I'm saying this today. Well, this event represents one of the many and multiple opportunities and channels that are available to all stakeholders around the world to contribute to the IRMA standards revision process and to influence the future of IRMA, the IRMA system. Today, you can actually use either the chat function to send your comments, feedback, concerns, recommendations, propositions. You can share content with the whole audience, but please note that you cannot use it in an anonymous way. Unlike the Q&A function, which is the other option for you today to submit your questions, suggestion, recommendations to IRMA, you can use the Q&A function. The button is located at the bottom of your screen. Might be in the top right corner if you're on a smartphone. And there you can decide to submit your content in an anonymous way. And you just need to tick the option that says, that reads send anonymously. And all the content you will share with us today will be saved, recorded and considered by IRMA as part of the standard revision process, as with any other communication channel or contribution channels that are available out there. So I'm clearly already inviting you all to, if you already have comments or experience with the chain of custody draft standard, if you've read the new draft and there are things you want to share or ask today, please start using the chat and the Q&A right now and use it as we go along. So the IRMA revision process itself, just a little bit of information for those of you who may not be familiar or aware. IRMA is undertaking a comprehensive revision of our standards. This allows us to ensure that the IRMA system and the IRMA standards remain accountable to all sectors, all stakeholders. They remain aligned with our mission and vision. It's an opportunity for us to make sure the standards remain up to date. It's an opportunity for us to add clarity, to make the standards clearer, more accessible, especially with the standard for responsible mining, also to make sure that things are easier to audit, but also for the chain of custody standard here to make it clear and more accessible. It's also an opportunity for us to add consistency between the different chapters that are similar, align the structure of our standards, and make sure we embed practical, good management procedures and practices. And finally, it's a great opportunity for us to make sure we can we fill any gaps. So any significant environmental or social issues where the IRMA standards would have fallen behind over the course of 5 years for the IRMA standard for responsible mining and 2 years for the IRMA standard on the chain of custody standard. And if we go to the next slide, to also clarify and explain that as part of this revision standard, or revision process, there are two major things really happening on top of everything. IRMA is evolving to address key phases of the mineral supply chain. So not only the mining operations per se, as they are currently limited to in the IRMA standard for responsible mining that was officially released and launched in 2018, but also now encompassing mineral exploration and development and mineral processing. So we had put out 2 draft standards in 2021, the IRMA Ready standard for exploration and development, and the draft standard for responsible mineral processing. Given the huge overlap between these three and demands from stakeholders, we have decided to integrate them into one unified standard for responsible mining and mineral processing that we released in October. And now I'll turn to my colleague, Christy, to tell you more about the other standard that IRMA has been working on.
Thank you, Pierre. And I'll mention that we have given a slower overview of the chain of custody standard in a prior webinar, and you can access that recording and materials in multiple languages on the IRMA website. We'll briefly recap that overview here and then do a deeper dive into your questions and comments, which can come now at any time, and look at some of the consultation questions. As Pierre mentioned, we're evolving at IRMA to cover a broader supply chain due diligence framework, moving from our responsible mining standard to the responsible mining and mineral processing standard that covers exploration, mining, and mineral processing. And this webinar is focused on the draft chain of custody standard. And that new draft chain of custody standard helps us track IRMA audited material from the mine site to the end user. Purchasers want to source responsibly produced raw materials and want to know that all links in the mineral supply chain have been managed responsibly. And we are responsible for accurate claims and greater transparency across supply chains and watching how IRMA audited material flows through the supply chain. That's what the chain of custody standard is enabling. In the next slide, I will just briefly mention the key objective of the chain of custody standard, which is to provide a common set of base level requirements for traceability for any IRMA audited material from the mine site to the end consumer. And we're doing this because we aim to provide entities in the supply chain with that common set of requirements for sourcing, tracking, accounting, handling, and selling IRMA achieving mines materials. And we also want to establish requirements that can be independently audited, verified, to provide an objective set of evidence for the flow of IRMA achieving mine materials through the supply chain. And moving on to the next slide, it's important to note that the draft chain of custody standard has not yet been approved by our board. We're inviting your comments, your input, your questions, your guidance, and we will, and we have at the beginning of each chapter noted consultation questions, notes to help you in your review. These will inform the IRMA Secretariat to update the draft accordingly and take it back to the board for their review and final approval. Moving on to the next slide, I'll turn back to my colleague Pierre to give you a bit more of an overview.
Yeah, thanks very much, Christy. Just a couple more slides before we go into the actual proposed changes and the content of the chain of custody standard, to let you know or remind you that this new draft, this V2 version, has been informed by the review of other standards, including a number of chain of custody related and stewardship specific standards such as the ISO 22095, the IRMA P754, the work of the London Platinum Palladium Responsible Guidance, Responsible Steel, and the Responsible Jewelry Council. We also have developed a number of chain of custody tools and frameworks. We've taken into account all the sort of evolution of expectations around best practice, evolution in terms of the demands of the different actors along the value chains. We've looked at a number of issues that have been emerging also at the international level. We have taken into account all the comments that we received on the first draft, and I also wanted to thank everyone who contributed and all of you who have been sending feedback and comments to it. And also this work has been informed by our ongoing stakeholder engagement activities. If we go to the next slide, I'll tell you how you can participate into this revision of the chain of custody standards. So the public consultation period is open. It started at the end of October last year. It's a 90-day public comment period. So you still have the whole of January pretty much to send your contribution and recommendations and comments. As I said, there are many ways to participate, this event today being one of them. All the comments that we receive will be considered equally and in an objective manner. As I said earlier, everything that you share with us today in the Q&A or chat will be taken as the same value as other contributions via other channels. We will publish a public summary of all the comments that we receive and explain how we're suggesting or proposing to address the recommendations. This is why it's important also for you to know, be reminded that your comments may be treated in a confidential way if you don't want your names and institutions to be published or attributed. So today, if you use the Q&A function, that's how you can make it confidential if you desire. And if you use the other channels, just make sure you let us know that your comments should be treated confidentially. So if we go to the next slide, the different channels that you can use besides this live consultation and the different events that we're still running until later in January, you can use the email address, the dedicated email address that we have. It is comments@responsiblemining.net. Alternatively, you can use our WhatsApp line and also our physical address to send your comments and contributions. And now I'll turn to my colleague, Jim, to take you through the proposed changes in this new version of the chain of custody standard. Jim, over to you.
Hello, everybody. So I'm going to briefly go through the major changes that we're talking about here from version 1 to version 2. And essentially the gap that we've identified in terms of needing to add, in particular, what we're identifying here as book and claim material counting. So I think we can go to the next slide. Okay. So when you look at what's out there presently today, the various types of accounting models that have been proposed by various entities, the three that we most commonly see that are societally accepted, if you will, are identity preserved, segregated, and controlled blending. Now, all three of these have in common that in terms of a physical chain of custody, it's very short. For one thing, you can identify where the material comes from. For example, in this case, we're saying an IRMA mine, and where it goes to. And it doesn't change hands, it doesn't get mixed with other materials, various other aspects. Identity preserved is kind of the gold star, if you will, where you would have a single mine or producer providing the material, and it ends up at the end of the supply chain. The reality is, though, that doesn't occur very often. The segregated really applies to when you have more than one mine. And we'll look at these in a little bit more detail in a second. And then the control blending is when you actually can dictate, if you will, how much IRMA material is in there and assure that it's either IRMA material or some other material at a particular percent. Those are all good, but they don't actually describe what the mining industry, processing industry actually does. So mass balance is kind of the fundamental practice, if you will, that every mine and mineral processor deploys in order to essentially account for its production. And including that kind of model really allows the industry to use and provide, in terms of allowing for a chain of custody to be tracked, their existing information. And it's something that I think most of the industry would agree. This is the basis upon which they do their business. It's great if you could do these other chain of custodies, but they're certainly, for some commodities in particular, not very practical. Then we have the additional chain of essentially model, if you will. Let's see that. Yeah, it really is the book and claim model. And the main attribute of the book and claim is that, unlike the first four models, the book and claim, there is actually no true flow of the metal from the producer to the end user. There's simply a claim that the producer makes that it gets extended to the end user. And again, we'll talk about this. This is the most controversial because, again, the physical flow doesn't exist. And we'll talk a little bit more. Christy will talk more later about why it is we're proposing this, and would note that it's subject to approval by the IRMA board. So next slide. So this is a simplified diagram of the identity preserved model. And I'm going to show each of the different models that we have in the chain of custody. I would encourage those of you that are on the call that are producers, end users, folks who might be in between, to think about presently what your production situation is and how it might apply to these different models. And we'd be very interested in hearing from you, getting feedback as to how these different models may or may not apply to your situation, kind of the pros and cons you might see coming out of this. So again, the identity preserved model is the most direct model. Typically, and what it really is production from a single company's particular source can be certified or verified. And then as you go downstream, it essentially stays within the same chain of custody. There's no mixing, no other even IRMA mines coming in. And that allows the end product to have a claim such as I put here, that says the lithium used in this battery is IRMA 75 sourced from the Solar project owned by company X. And in fact, when you look at the lithium supply chain to a greater degree than one might expect, you can do this with lithium. It certainly is achievable. If not today, it's certainly being planned by some companies in the future that want to shorten the supply chain, if you will. But let's go to the next slide. Now, the segregated model really is just allowing for the addition of two or more mines rather than just from a single mine. So the example I'm showing here is for two IRMA 75 mines, but this could be for 2 or 3 IRMA 75 mines. That there's not a limit necessarily. The idea would be, though, that they would both be IRMA 75. You wouldn't be necessarily mixing an IRMA 75 and an IRMA 50. So when you have this type of claim, again, it's the same type of claim, but it's just more broad for the end product. The end user claim being that the lithium used in this battery is IRMA 75 from company X. So you're really no longer referring to a particular mine, but rather to the company or corporation entity, if you will, producing the material. Let's go ahead to the next. Now, in a lot of cases, what we're seeing, and recycled being a very good example within the lithium supply chain, is that in addition to material from a particular source, we also have a recycle material that's coming back in. Now, IRMA doesn't certify or look to verify, if you will, the recycled material chain. That's something we'll look at and consider perhaps sometime in the future. We do, however, in the chain of custody, provide some guidance specific to recycled material. And this is a good example. If a producer were to take lithium from an IRMA 75 mine and introduce, in this case, I'm suggesting a 25% recycle stream, then the end product, again, providing that there's no mixing with other materials and other things as you go downstream through processing, distribution, and manufacturing, the end product, the claim could then be that the lithium in this battery is 75% IRMA 75 and 25% recycled material. And I think, you know, the encouragement or hope we all have is that the amount of recycled material over time will increase as it becomes available in the marketplace. Next slide, please. So those three I'm going to say the kind of simple examples that we have out there, but they only allow for a very small amount of, well, the larger mining and minerals commodities that are out there. The mass balance model, particularly when we start to talk about larger quantity production of copper, nickel, gold, various other streams, it becomes platinum group metals, for example. It becomes much more common that this is what you have available because, and you have a myriad of sources, mines of various types of things contributing. There are two methods, the rolling average percentage method, as well as a credit method. And rather than try to go through those here, we have examples of each one of them, and I'll cover those then. So let's see, I'll go to the next slide. So the mass balance model, for those of you that aren't familiar with mass balance, the whole idea is what goes in has to come out. And it's a method that the mining industry, I might say, has perfected over the years. A lot of the work that I did as a mineral processor for large corporations was, in fact, to help them produce methodologies that would ensure that their mass balances in terms of what they're producing, what they expected hitting the mill, coming out of the mill, going to the refinery, et cetera, that those were very accurately accounted for. And in fact, we'd go in and do, we call them, metallurgical audits on a regular basis where we would go through the entire process and try to ensure we knew where everything was, both for the purpose of ensuring, making sure our production is optimal, but also it's something you do just to assure against theft through your process. And so there's a lot of reasons why we do this and why I think the mining industry has learned to do it very well. And as Pierre mentioned, there are existing guidances that we've relied upon from the mining industry in terms of the ISO standard, but also the Australian metallurgical accounting folks who have been looking at this and putting a lot of effort into putting an industry standard together for metallurgical accounting. So this example, very typical to what we are seeing out there for a lot of these different commodities that have a large historic production base. I've shown it for lithium here, but you could more so apply this to copper, platinum group metals, various other metals, as I mentioned. But we have an IRMA 75 mine in this example, an IRMA 50 mine, a non-IRMA mine, and a recycled material stream, all going into, let's say, for example, a single chemical processing plant. In the case of lithium, you could also have the same thing happening, of course, as I said, in going to a smelter or a refinery in other metal supply chains. Now, the rolling average percentage implementation method says we're going to take, and if you noticed here, I purposefully put the source from the IRMA 75 might be 40 to 50% of the flow. IRMA 50, 25 to 30, non-IRMA 25 to 30, recycled 10 to 20. It's purposefully varied because in reality in industry, that's what you get. You might project what is going to happen the next year. And then we all know in the mining industry in particular, what you actually get is what you get, and you have to change that. So I've shown these percentages here, recognizing that they may vary, say, for example, throughout a 6-month or 1-year period as well. In the rolling average percentage method, you take the average over a period and you essentially blend it all together. Even though you know on the back end, it wasn't always blended together all at the same percentage, but you take it for a period of time. And that could be, as again, 3 months, 6 months, a year. One of the things we're getting for feedback, we'd like to hear more from other folks. Different commodities, it might be different periods of time that it really makes sense to do this averaging period. The idea of 6 months that we initially proposed, that may not be applicable or the correct approach for every industry. When you take this approach, what it allows the end user to claim is this lithium in this battery would be a given percent of IRMA achieving material, X% and X% recycled material. You would actually end up with a percentage, and it might be 60, it might be 61, it might be 59. And so it would vary from period to period as you did the rolling average percentage implementation method. It does allow for a very accurate claim. However, again, I think it's very important to say that unless all of the end product is going to a single end product, you really don't have an assurance at any given time of how much is or isn't IRMA, because again, they may or may not be blending at some point and bring this all in just one equal amount all the time. So let's go to the next slide. And again, your thoughts and feedback on these very much are what we're looking for here. Now, the credit method, which is something that is much cleaner, works much better in terms of applying the claim, as you'll see here, but does come at some risk again of even further not knowing for certain that you have the material. But taking the same situation as in the previous figure, where we have these different feed materials going into common processing from a lot of different sources at varying percents. What the end user claim allows the end user to do, and essentially they're getting this information again from the producer, is that they can take the non-IRMA end product and the IRMA end products and separate them out. So the best example I can give you is if you had 1,000 kilograms of lithium, and of that amount, you had 600 kilograms coming from IRMA mines. Even though they're all mixed together, what it allows you to do out of that 1,000 kilograms is allow for an IRMA end product claim to be made on that 600 kilograms. So when you look at that example, what it does, and I'm showing it here kind of just in the simplified sense that you have an IRMA end product and a non-IRMA end product. And the IRMA end product essentially is what they would make the claim on, but they would be limited to that percentage, if you will, that 60% in the example I gave of that material to actually make an IRMA end product claim. So these are those where we continue the physical chain of custody. And then the last one that I'm showing here is the book and claim model. And this is the one that is most controversial. It's one that many standards, et cetera, would prefer not to engage in. However, I would say that as I've studied, considered the different standards that are out there, and in particular watched what has been implemented, what's been made to work, really the book and claim model, given the present market situation that we have today versus what we might have more idealistically or sometime in the future, it becomes very necessary. And the best example that's out there is simply for those that fly, when you start to look at use of synthetic fuels and other things, it's the model that the airline industry has picked up and is really moving forward and making some real inroads, I believe, into those type of efforts. So in this case, taking the same situation we had before, it's the mix would be there. Essentially, the production from those IRMA 75 and IRMA 50 mines, the 60% of the production I talked about in the earlier example, that would be sold to an end user, if you will, or provided to an end user, whatever the terminology we should use. And when we do that, they would get credit for that amount back to the producer, the end user. Now, for one thing, it definitely requires that there be a register of the claims at the producer, that also at the end user, so we ensure that the claims that are made are not overbooked. But also, if you look at the claim we're suggesting, at least in this draft, is the lithium in this battery is IRMA achieving material based on a book and claim model and may not include the physical presence of IRMA achieving material. The quantity credit equals the percentage IRMA achieving material produced over the past 6 months. Now, in talking with industry and looking at this, there may be ways to communicate the same information without perhaps what some would connotate as a negative connotation, saying that may not include the physical presence of IRMA achieving material. But I would say at the same time, there's a real necessity of being transparent about what we're talking about with book and claim. So would be glad to spend more time with any of you explaining this. Just contact Pierre and let us know you want to do that. But this is essentially, these are the different models and what's behind them. I'll hand it back over to Christy.
Thank you, Jim. And we look forward to your comments, especially on this book and claim supply chain model. Our rationale for incorporating the book and claim methodology is threefold. First, as Jim mentioned, in reality, as we've talked with entities across supply chains for certain materials like PGMs involve a high level of mixing material from multiple mine sources. We know that not allowing a book and claim system would require a level of physical segregation of IRMA material that's not practical. And we know that processes are continuous and require a blended feed. If you envision a smelter and the material coming into a smelter, is not feasible to just stop that operation, clean out the smelter, only put IRMA audited material in, and begin again. We hope at some point we have a nonstop feed of IRMA audited supply that will make that possible. I'm smiling just thinking about it. But until then, we see the need for this type of methodology. Second, in the next slide, we know that nearly all current mine material supply chains rely on tolling, brokering, trading, warehousing, shipping material as they meet contractual requirements and demands in their supply chain. So requiring material segregation where there is a requirement for warehousing separately these materials would require really dramatic modification of existing practices that likely just wouldn't happen. And what we don't want is for our chain of custody, our standard to just sit on a shelf. We want it to be actively, practically used and have an impact on making supply chains more transparent and on making sure there's no greenwashing in the IRMA system. Third, on the next slide, we also see, again, this point that not all existing chain of custody models for mined materials are widely used, especially in these complex supply chains that we've mentioned. So including a book and claim option will drive greater uptake and participation in the IRMA system. And we are looking at IRMA at industrial scale supply chains, which really underscores the need for dealing with more complex systems. And moving to the next slide, we're starting here to get more into the weeds of the chain of custody standard. And we will take the next 20 minutes to go chapter by chapter through the changes, but also warmly welcome you to interrupt us with your questions, with your comments. So please feel free to start those coming so that we can engage with you live. We'll continue in this way in a chapter-based approach and welcome your input per chapter as well. But interrupt us at any time. We're here to engage with you. So looking just at the first chapter, we have updated the structure of the chain of custody standard to align with ISO. And you can see the topics that we had in the first chapter in our original draft and what they look like now. We are addressing many of those topics that are listed there in version 1 and subsequent chapters, and we'll share, where there are changes to sourcing policies, that first point, in the next slide. And you'll see throughout the draft these consultation questions, and we would love to hear from you if you have any input specifically on these questions now. Do you see any reason not to utilize this ISO standard as the initial basis for requirements in our chain of custody standard? At IRMA, we really aim to reduce duplication, to create greater consistency across standards. But if there are other standards that we should be looking at, we welcome you to point us to those in addition to your feedback on ISO 22095. We did eliminate the requirement for a sourcing policy and commitment. We have other types of policy commitments, but we'd like to hear from you. What are your thoughts about that? Eliminating that requirement. We're doing that because we know there are different types of supply chains, so this may not apply to all. But we want to hear from you more what your thoughts on that are, and if our subsequent policy requirements are sufficient. In the next slide, we move to chapter 2 and our documentation and assurance requirements. So we have detailed requirements in this chapter and want to hear from you what you think about those. Are we missing anything? Is there documentation that you think is should not be included? And we envisioned that reports related to a chain of custody audit would correlate with these documentation requirements, these record keeping requirements. So also be reviewing with a lens of What do you want to see in an IRMA audit report? In the next slide, we want to hear from you if you are a company, a technology provider that incorporates blockchain, other types of technology. There's increasing use of AI, for example, a wide range of platforms. We as a standard do not require any certain type of technology, but we do want to be compatible, especially in this chain of custody standard, with existing types of technologies. So we'd like to hear from you. Do you find these requirements to be blockchain compatible? In the next slide, we move to chapter 3, and we have covered in detail changes to material accounting methodologies. And in the next slide, we ask a consultation question specific to incorporating the book and claim model, hoping to hear from you, your input on if you think we should include that. Should we create a registry to log claims? How might that be useful? Do you have experience with that you can offer to us? On the next slide, we move into chapter 4 on sales and shipping, noting that changes have been made to align with the RSB chain of custody procedure, for example, to really distinguish between information required for entities at various points in the supply chain. And here in the next few slides, we provide that detail of exactly what we have included here in sales and shipping. So starting with A, which is for mine sites, including on-site mineral processing facilities, the type of documentation we would require. I won't go through it point by point, but we would like to have your inputs on these, the types of record keeping we're requiring. In the next slide, we move to off-site mineral processors and manufacturers. So those facilities, you see a list here of everything we would want for them to document. Is there anything missing here? Anything you would want to add? Anything that's unreasonable? Where are there gaps? We would like to hear from you. In the next slide, we move to this complex web of storage facilities, warehousers, traders. What we would like to hear from those entities and the supply chain, the documentation we would like for them to provide. So again, seeking your input on these more detailed requirements on sales and shipping, record keeping. In the next slide, we have a consultation question asking again for your input on each of these 3 categories that have been revised and the detailed record keeping requirements. Are there any suggestions, any additional records you think we should ask for those entities to retain? Moving on to chapter 5, we go into IRMA claims. And we provided a lot of detail here. It's very important to us at IRMA to have very truthful claims. Like, this is the core of who we are, of our integrity. We are very careful about any claims that are being made. And that applies as well in this chain of custody standard. So we've provided you with details on 5 different chain of custody models and the types of claims that could be made for IRMA achieving material. Moving on to the next slide, We have a consultation question. IRMA is presently asking all entities to allow for internal review of all claims by IRMA and to flag any invalid claims as they occur. So what we do at IRMA is approve in advance any claims before they are made. This can slow down the process for an entity to be issuing reports, for example. We do respond very quickly to requests for information around communication and claims. We have extensive guidance around communications and claims, but we'd like to hear from you around what you would like the IRMA Secretariat's role to be in internal review of all claims, making sure that no invalid claims occur. What process do you recommend? Moving on to the next question here is around book and claim and supporting that requirement. What type of language should we allow in book and claims? Do you propose alternative language? Right now, we are asking for claims to be accompanied. If there's a book and claim methodology used, then no actual physical flow of materials can be verified. What are your thoughts on this claim, this language?
Christy, I noticed we have a question.
Let's go to the question.
And it somewhat pertains to the same one. So I just wanted to actually answer this one live, if that's okay.
Great. If you would state the question for those who are watching the recording, Jim, and answer, that would be terrific.
I was going to do that. So the question, so everybody's aware, is can you please clarify on mass balance? As far as I can understand mass balance, it does not require physical separation of IRMA and non-IRMA material. And I might just say right now, you're correct. Okay, it does not require that. With mass balance and in rather complex supply chains, you would usually not know whether any material from IRMA audited mines ended up in your product. At least this is how I read ISO 22095. I'm not sure how book and claim is different though. And just so the person who asked the question is aware, we've gotten a very similar question from other folks. And I think it makes sense of the question, particularly when you might think through your own supply chain. In theory, and this is where we have to look at the time frames, the particular situations and others. If you have a constant blending process, even if it contains all these different amounts and there are different percentages, while you can't guarantee you have, for example, 62% of a given material, you would be able to be assured that there's some amount of material would be IRMA material. But you're absolutely right. Once you go into a mass balance, it's recognizing that we have this variability in feeds, other things that go on through the processes, and you can't actually be, if you will, 100% assured. Various mass balance supplies will be to lesser and greater degrees assurable as to that physical presence. And I think that's something we just have to recognize will happen with different commodities if we apply this particular approach. The main thing I would say that book and claim is different though. There is simply no guarantee, no attempt to even provide that physical presence. You basically disconnect the two altogether. You can really be completely assured in book and claim that it's very unlikely that you have physical presence being transferred.
Thank you, Jim.
Is a good question and one we need to work on more. Thanks, Chris.
Keep the questions coming. And we'll move on to the next slide around the chain of custody verification process. This is described in Chapter 6. And you can see the flow of the verification process here, where different entities in the supply chain have different obligations when it comes to verification. But IRMA will require an independent third-party audit of the supply chain. And right now we have requirements for an audit to take place every 3 years with a surveillance audit in between. We'd love to hear from you if for chain of custody, and given the complexity of supply chains, how they change from year to year, that many entities are reporting annually on supply chains, if we should move toward a type of annual audit instead of the system that's every 3 years with surveillance in between. But we seek your input as well on this chapter, which is really the heart of the chain of custody standard. How will it be audited? How are we ensuring and using third-party auditing to verify the supply chain to create and enhance transparency? And I'll turn back to my colleague, Pierre.
Yeah, thank you very much, Christy, for taking us through all the key consultation questions, or some of the ones that we've selected and highlighted here. So again, to remind everyone that the consultation period is open till the end of the month, and you can use those different contribution channels to send your comments, feedback, concerns, or recommendations. I think in terms of the questions, clearly this tricky question between book and claim, mass balance, where there might actually be no actual IRMA verified material in the end product, has been raised before by others, and Jim just addressed it. I think one question that we also have ourselves as an open one is around the format of the audit report. I think, as you may know, in the audience, it's been instrumental and critical to IRMA to provide a high level of transparency when it comes to the results of the independent audits and assessments that are conducted against the IRMA standard for responsible mining, and would like to do the same with the chain of custody standard. So that if we have any already ideas or models that we want to test or share with the attendees, that's something that you're invited to comment on. Christy, Jim, I think another question that we also hear is around the I think applicability when it comes to very large, for example, manufacturing companies that are sourcing multiple products. Will they be allowed to use different models to make their claims on different types of metals and supply chain? How do you see this happening to some of the complex companies that add then another complexity layer to the already complex supply chains that we mentioned, that Jim mentioned today? Is this all very theoretical, or do we see opportunities for all kinds of entities along the supply chain, whether small or big or complex or simple?
Thank you, Pierre. And I'll invite Jim to jump in with a couple of thoughts as well. But we have been looking at supply chains that exist of IRMA audited material, and you'll see in the annex to the draft chain of custody standard some examples of existing supply chains. And you get a sense there, even though those tables, those graphics are already oversimplified, of the complexity of supply chains, but it is not impossible to track and trace those supply chains. And we have made the material accounting methodologies a wider range of methodologies in order to respond to exactly those complexities and to become more practical. And we have had, dozens of calls and many with actors across entities across the supply chain to really make sure that we're being practical as possible, and adding these additional material accounting methodologies is really helping us be responsive to the reality right now in the marketplace. As Jim noted, we may not always need a book and claim system. Right now, we see it would bring more attention to IRMA, more engagement in IRMA, and greater transparency in supply chains, and that's what we want to see. Jim, any thoughts you want to add to that, or responses to any of the questions?
No, I would just, add, and sorry if we haven't had a chance with the questions that just popped up. Maybe I can try to.
Yeah, I think you can address this one as well, Jim. There's one
Right.
just for you about the term IRMA material. How do we define IRMA material? And what about facility that would be verified or audited against IRMA some time ago? What is then the forward period of time that it is for a material to be named or considered as IRMA material? And then we have another one, but maybe first this one, Jim.
Right. So the one from Stephen Young in terms of the physical presence, particularly in terms of facilities. No, this would be where from the time one wants to make that claim, the segregation would need to actually begin occurring. And so I think, that's part of what we were catching up with, if you will, and we need to address as IRMA, is the fact that we do have mines that are right now under the IRMA system. They're producing those materials and needing to bring those in, keep them segregated, and move them through the system is part of what we need to address and emphasize. Because if we don't keep them segregated, then the ability to make any claims, including the mass balance claims, would simply disappear. So it's a very good point, very good question.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. And we have a few other questions. There are two comments around blockchain technology. So one coming from Mark and asking if IRMA recommend or utilize any specific blockchain protocols. And there's a question from Marnie that says, I believe blockchain technology requires loads of energy. Has this issue been solved by no? And if so, blockchain might be a helpful solution. And there's a big risk of double accounting. I think that's to the other question around mass balance and book and claim. So it would help if IRMA maintained a registry to monitor volumes. Any comments on those before we wrap up?
So the questions on blockchain technology, we do not require use of any particular blockchain technology. We do aim to be compatible and see that thus far we are compatible with blockchain technologies. I hear you on remaining concerns around energy use, et cetera. We remain open to talk with technology providers, to learn about what's forthcoming, and aim to be compatible with those types of technology solutions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Christy. I think on the point of the energy consumption, there's a lot of work happening around blockchain. One must not think that all blockchain technology are equivalent to the Bitcoin. And this whole, cryptocurrency mining is actually the reason why these blockchain is so energy intensive. The whole proof of work system is actually rewarding Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies miners for using a lot of energy, but there are other models that are completely different and that do not require such huge and large energy consumption. So we'll also be looking in that and keeping an eye on it. We've reached the end of the session, so I'd like to thank my colleagues today, and of course to thank everybody who joined us today. Thank you for sending your comments, contributions, and I am inviting you again to use the remaining of the public comment period to submit any more comments, recommendations, concerns, or feedback. that you have regarding the chain of custody standard. And we remain here, we're available, we're here to help and serve you. Thank you very much.